My name is Max Bazerman, and along with Iris Bonet, who you met yesterday, I'm the co-chair of the Behavioral Insights Group at Harvard. But we're here really today to talk to David about his new book, Inside the Nudge Unit. And I'll briefly say, before getting started with some questions, that for a long time now, as a teacher who likes to give out homework, even if someone isn't my student, I've long recommended that if you're going to be in this field, it's required reading that you read Thinking Fast and Slow and Nudge. And I would now say that we have a third edition to that, that people need to read the Inside the Nudge Unit. You don't have to buy it. You can just borrow it from a friend. The important part is reading it, not buying it. But David, can you get us started by telling us the goals of this book, why you wrote it, what you're trying to achieve, and what you hope people get out of it?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, guys, for coming. I know you're up against, thank you, dessert and also very interesting Maury data. But yeah, look, I actually do feel quite strongly that if governments want to use these kinds of approaches, they have to be quite open and transparent. But I think they should be open and transparent in general. There's also limits to how much you can do and say through a press release when you give out an individual result, and there are lots of finer details involved, so you can get much more depth. The third thing, of course, for us, we were always interested in spreading the approach genuinely, particularly across the public service, not only in the UK or in general, and so that was always part of our mission, to essentially explain in simple terms so that someone else literally could read the book and say, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I can be a local authority or something. I could use that approach in my day job. And so hopefully it will do all those things.
Mm-hmm. And what fears do you have as people read this book and go out and start to nudge?
That's a great question, isn't it? Well, I mean, one of the things we often have seen in other policy areas is that you get an overuse of the approach. I mean, famously in Britain, we had this around targetry. It became very fashionable, you know, have a million different targets, and it was generally felt it then got overused. We definitely already have lots of examples where people say, literally I've had ministers say to me, oh, I saw this sign, it was a really neat nudge you guys did, and we're like, actually, we didn't do it. So that's in many ways a good thing, but on the other hand, if it's used poorly or insensitively, I think it's a major danger. The other thing that hangs over, I think for all of us, you know, Richard Thaler's comment about nudge for good, there are lots of other people who are busy and organizations nudging, not necessarily for good. And you put the knowledge out there, it can be used for good or bad, and you have to hope that people will use it for the former rather than the latter.
David, tell us a bit more about the journey of the Behavioral Insights team. I mean, clearly a huge success story, your role model for many, many other teams around the world. What were some of the challenges, or what was the biggest challenge that your team had to overcome? And maybe also what was the biggest success that you now, in retrospect, in a very short time, were able to celebrate?
Right. I mean, remember, a lot of the challenges predate the team. So one of the things that I mentioned a bit in the book is, for those who haven't been following policy wonk issues for years and years, is when I used to work in the strategy unit, I worked for Tony Blair for 6 years, and one of the papers I was involved in, we wrote, I led on, was on using behavioural approaches in policy and why it would be a good idea in 2003. Anyway, it was a disaster. I mean, in terms of the media reaction, it was an utter disaster. We had a one-line reference to fat taxes and so on, and it became a big, big headline, and it was everywhere. Anyway, it was kind of one of those just storms that blew up. And the PM.
And what was the main criticism at the time?
That it was nanny state. It was both nanny state, in fact, not just nanny state, it was nanny state on speed. You know, because it's like, not only are you nanny stating, it's you're going to do it in our heads as well. And this played very, very badly. And so I was kind of seared on my soul, really aware of the fact that this is, Richard in the foreword talks about hindsight bias. In retrospect, it's like, oh yeah, of course, it was a big success, you know, that sort of very, you know, by no means guaranteed this would be a significant success. Either in terms of course, the results, or in terms of the political, where it would be received by the public and the media. So I guess I'm saying, in my mind, one of the key things from the outset was always, this really could be a big disaster. It might well not work at all. So it was fantastic. We were able to assemble the right kind of political administrative support. We had enough time to be able to get out there, get results, and be able to persuade Whitehall, before things came crashing down, which they were always vulnerable to do. In terms of our biggest successes, I mean, it's interesting. I feel quite strongly, we still got a long way to go, but still, I think the job centre work often stands out to me because I think it is so remarkable. It's complicated because it's more than just tweaking or adjusting a wording. You have to change someone else's behaviour, the job centre advisor's behaviour, as well as the claimant. And we really didn't know if it would do anything at all. So to find that it did lead to these quite significant results in terms of getting people back to work faster, and subsequently that it's been possible to replicate and in fact even have stronger results in Australia and Singapore, I think it's a very nice result, because it's also like, why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to try and design a process that enables someone basically to improve their job search, get back to work faster? It just feels like it's such a nice story on so many levels, I think, and illustrates the power of the approach.
Some of your maybe riskier projects that you decided to adopt included e-cigarettes. Tell us more about e-cigarettes.
Yeah. It's interesting, we try and be as open as possible in the book. There is the odd story where you feel like there's some stuff we can't put in. There is a discussion of e-cigarettes, but you're right, it was very, very controversial. And a lot of, not least in the public health community, were and remain in some quarters really very worried about e-cigarettes. So, but it was a piece on the BBC recently discussing and contrasting different government approaches to e-cigarettes and pointing out that basically the UK has become pretty much the most liberal place in the world in relation to their sales. So, yeah, it wasn't an RCT, it was one of those examples where we just felt like the behavioural literature, albeit partly on, lab studies about substitution and the effectiveness of e-cigarettes, suggested that we were on the wrong side of the argument in terms of where government was heading. So to be able to engage, significant figures, including the PM in the discussion, who actually, as it happens, has been a smoker in his life and had actually used an e-cigarette, which was an interesting phenomenon in its own right. But anyway, to go through it and then say, actually, look, this is going to be a big battle, but we think this is the right way to take it. And it's not over and done and dusted, but we do think it's, if you try and work out in quantitative terms, in fact, the Public Health England recently did a report estimating there's more than 1 million extra smokers have quit in the UK in recent years as a result of e-cigarettes. And you say, well, what would you pay for a drug that will do an equivalent of that? It's off the scale. It's tens of billions. And interestingly, of course, it's a nudge not developed by government, but the question is, how does the government respond? And in our view, many governments are responding the wrong way to it.
But you just told us about the benefits. So you're concerned that you're misestimating the costs and you're on the wrong side of the argument.
Well, look, these things are never perfect. There's always this combination of, we try and be as scientific as we can about this, I think many of us, and fairly balance the argument. But there are counter-arguments. There are certainly arguments in relation to resocialization. Mm-hmm. There's concerns about flavoured products that may be more attractive to kids. There's this fascinating, of course, the precautionary principle that's often rehearsed in relation to policy, which is, there is a risk and therefore you shouldn't do it. Of course, you have to look at the balance of risks, and our view was, because it's behaviourally relatively familiar, it's much easier to drive substitution than desistance, particularly of an addictive behaviour. So we felt we were on the right side of the argument. Albeit, we have introduced age restrictions on the sales and so on, and you still got to look at it. There are also other risks, like what else are people going to put in an e-cigarette? But I just made one other thing. I think you also have to anticipate, where does the argument go to next? What does it make possible politically or behaviourally? And one of the things I think the campaigners who worried about it on the other side have missed is that e-cigarettes, ironically, are probably your best chance that there has been in generations of having a serious discussion about we might actually be able to get rid of cigarettes. Mm-hmm. Which is a phenomenally big deal if you think about that.
So you mentioned you couldn't do an RCT on e-cigarettes, but obviously you've done a lot of RCTs. Can you tell us about the evolution of how politicians think about experiments or RCTs as a concept, and how that's evolved over time, and what you expect to see in other countries?
Yeah, by the way, it doesn't mean you can't do RCTs. Some people have been doing them, but on some of the bigger policies, the timescale we were working. My own view is one of the biggest and most important legacies of the introduction of behavioral sort of science and approaches into governments it's made credible, almost popular, that may be too strong a word, the experimental approach. And it sort of brought it through almost without noticing that actually that's so part and parcel of the behavioral approach, certainly as we have sought to practice it. And even if you don't care about, a lot of the behavioral bits, to incorporate experimental methods deeply into policy is a fundamental game changer, and indeed to professional practice. If we can touch everything that we do and say, oh, could we try some variations on how we teach, or how we do social work, or how we do all of the myriad of other things that 5 million public servants in the UK alone do, it's just phenomenal. And another way of thinking about it is that, we're kind of in the dark ages on most policy and professional practice, and that if we're honest about it, apart from a tiny percentage, we don't really know whether things are truly effective. And we certainly don't know if there's a small variation that might make them more effective. So that battle is by no means done, and one of the reasons for having these kind of discussions in this book and others is to genuinely engage in that public debate about why those experimental methods are the right way forward. And there are continued media stories about, oh my God, government is experimenting on you. That's terrible, terrible. What's the alternative? Government stumbles along not knowing what the hell it's doing most of the time. I'm pretty clear about which side of the argument I think we should be on.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask one more question and then open to all of your thoughts and questions about the book. Your last chapter looks into the future, which as behavioral scientists we know is a risky thing to do. Yeah. But tell us a bit more about what you expect is going to happen, and also what are your hopes for the world, for other nudge units, for experimentation across the sectors, really.
Well, as there's been some discussion at actually it's a fantastic event, isn't it? The last a couple of days, is that there's certainly issues about scale up, but the last chapter is very much also trying to say, well, what are some of those really big challenges, as I mentioned in my comments yesterday, that behavioral scientists, do we have something to say on these issues? Do we have something to say? Of course, historically there's been interest around group conflict or extremism, beyond the relatively obvious, but actually that policymakers might be able to use on some of these big issues. Great interest right now in productivity. Well, what does that really mean? What can you do for opportunity to help? Governments have spent huge sums of money in most countries trying to help the most disadvantaged, close the gap, etc. Much of which, if we're honest, has often been disappointing. I feel there's lots of really positive evidence that we're starting to unpack the black box of some of those causal processes using behavioral approaches and psychological ones, which give us new clues for different types of policy interventions. It's like, when they say we've found some new bit of the Amazon rainforest and we think there might be, 10,000 new drugs we'll be able to produce from it. It's like you kind of conceptually stumble onto a new bit of the rainforest as a policymaker, which could open up all kinds of possibilities, as Elder mentioned on that one. And the challenge is for us to go from the theory and what we're finding in the labs to say, well, what are the practical policy implications? And then, of course, to test them.
Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Any questions, thoughts?
David, over the last 18 months, you and the team have gone on this journey from being a kind of central government unit into being an independent company, and a much larger independent company. Can you talk a little bit about that journey and the kind of the things you've learned along the way? We can.
For those who don't know this, we're a rather odd company in as far as we are substantially owned by government still, and that brings with it all the warm embrace of some government, appropriate constraints that are in place. So we are very much, in our articles, we're defined as a social purpose company, so what we can and can't do. But what it's enabled us to do, some very practical things that partly drove it. A lot of it was, of course, driven by, we were receiving a lot of requests from other bits of the public sector to help. And sat in Downing Street or Cabinet Office, that was just very difficult to do. Very difficult, literally, to take on extra people, to change your budgets in the current austerity period. And also, it's actually quite complicated to be advising, sitting literally in Downing Street, and someone is paying you to do some policy work from some other organisation. It doesn't pass the Daily Mail test, as it would be said. So it's given us freedom to do that. And remember, if you believe, as many of us do, that you want the adoption to happen quite widely, then in which case you kind of want to respond to that. It's also enabled us to do some stuff potentially on products and services where the answer isn't just a government thing, but we can work with someone else and figure out a solution.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please. The mic is arriving. Just 1 second. Thank you very much.
Hello. Eric Singler, BVN Nudge Unit, French company. I would like to know if you use ethno-research to better understand obstacles, barriers to adopt the desired behavior, to observe people in real life, or is it just an expert process to create nudges?
It's definitely, so the question is partly about almost the use of ethnography. I mean, we sometimes refer to it more crassly as the sort of method acting approach to policy, which is to really get in there and experience and understand it. I mean, I think a lot of people feel that you can't really do it without doing that. And you're partly, the task for many of us is to marry that literature and the knowledge that is out there with really detailed understanding of what is happening in a given context or policy challenge. And it often takes you to a different place. And I mean, certainly on a personal level, I've had to have conversations with the PM on a given issue, like, switching, what's happening in the energy markets. And, literally I personally would have tried to switch my bill the weekend before. As it happens, I failed, which was an interesting lesson in its own right. So I think we found it very, very rich territory to understand that. And one of the challenges, I think, for the academic community sometimes is that they also need to marry that engagement in a real world process or problem. So.
I think we have time for one more last question. Thank you.
Robin White from Engine. I work Engine as a communication group. What's interesting to me is that the development of behavioral thinking has been much more effective in the public sector than apparently in the private sector. I spend quite a lot of my time trying to get my colleagues to be interested in it and not very successful. Can you give me any advice how I could get as much success in the private sector as you've had in the public sector?
Yeah, well, remember, I have caveated it with, I think we have so far to go still. So, it's half full, half empty. I mean, some of the, some areas, of course, notably some of the internet giants are using the experimentation on a very big scale. So, but there are also, one of the things it's taught us is actually some of the stuff, it feels like it's palpably obvious how to do it, and yet it clearly isn't obvious. So, I mean, we often talk about de-risking. Why would you try it? I think there are a number of sort of techniques to be used. Because what we really want is we're worried about making sure the private sector don't just use these techniques, but they use them for good. So there's some kind of deal to be done. I know we're kind of out of time, but I really want to, obviously this book, it's really nice to be able to do this, to be able to express. I do genuinely mean, I think it's important for us to be able to have this kind of debate and discussion. And so kind of thankful for some of my government handlers to allow it to be published. But also thanks, of course, there's so many people it takes to design a good trial, to develop a good bit of work. A lot of people have been involved in the success of the Behavioural Insight team. And so, of course, I should say thanks to many of them, some of whom are in this room. And I hope many of you will be involved in this kind of project going forward. And as Richard says, to nudge for good.
With that, let me give you 3 reasons why you should read the book. In addition to it providing lots of insight into behavioral insights, one is you learn about history. For example, you learn about how the potato was introduced in Europe. Mm-hmm. And you will learn that quite a bit of nudging was used to make that happen. It wasn't incentives, it wasn't forced. It was a nudge, but I won't spoil your enjoyment of the book. So you will learn about history, and you will get some insight into government workings that David just alluded to, which makes for fun reading. And then thirdly, it is just really inspiring and makes all of us want to go home and create our own nudge units. With that, good luck to you and congratulations to David.
Thank you.